Welcome back to another Sunday Q&A, and the first question comes from Gary. And do you like how these jeans are just hanging up here? Let me move that for you. But the first question comes from Gary, and he basically said, "Hey man, I can only work out on Saturdays and Sundays. How should I structure my training?" So this is tough. When you're this limited in your how much you can train, it's probably going to be difficult to see significant progress in all muscle groups across your entire body. And I think that if you only have 2 days a week to train and you're not like a rank beginner, which I doubt you are if you're watching my channel, I would really probably focus on prioritizing just a couple of muscle groups and maintaining the other ones. Luckily, hitting a muscle once a week when you're just focusing on maintaining it, I think that you'll be fine. So what I would likely do is I would pick 2 or 3 muscle groups that I'm like, hey, I'm going to really try to make progress with these muscle groups while my schedule is this crazy. Everything else I'm going to try to maintain. So maintenance level volumes for the majority of your muscles, and then for those few that you want to focus on, okay, those we can train a little bit more. And I would probably train those muscles on both of those days. So like say you really wanted to get those biceps going or something like that, I would probably do like maybe start with 4 or 5 sets on both Saturday and Sunday of biceps, and then progressively work that up to 20 or so sets to where you're doing 8 to 10 sets on both those days while maintaining other stuff. All right. But I would only do that with like 2 or 3 muscle groups, or else you're probably going to exceed the maximum amount of volume you can do systemically in a single session. Now, you could split your workouts into 2-a-days on Saturdays and Sundays. And hey, if you want to, that might allow you to actually make progress in more than just a couple of muscle groups. So maybe you train once in the morning and then once before dinner, but then your entire weekend, your time that's likely off of work is spent training. And if you're doing a 2-a-day on the weekend, then that's going to be pretty all-consuming of your life. So I would still lean towards like a couple of longer sessions on that weekend to where it's not necessarily consuming your entire weekend. But I would bring it down to only focusing on a couple of muscles. And then for your other muscles that you're maintaining, you could use myo reps, you can use drop sets, you can do stuff like that, and you can maintain those muscles on a relatively little amount of time cost. For most of that stuff, you can probably maintain on like 1/3 of the volume that might be required for you to grow. So say if you grow pretty well on like 12 to 15 sets, you could probably maintain on like 5 or so sets. 5 to 8 sets for sure, I would say. So that's how I would approach that. I would focus on only a couple of muscle groups and then really kind of allocate that volume towards those muscles. And maybe using myo reps, drop sets, stuff like that on the ones that you're just focusing on maintaining might be a good idea. All right, but that's kind of how I would approach that there. So hopefully that helps you out, Gary. Now, I got a question on Instagram. It's basically like, hey, I see all these studies that you post about, but a lot of them are in males, which totally, it's definitely unfortunate that a lot of the studies in the literature is majority focused on males. But I think that the concepts still apply. Like if you're a female, you still want to train within your MEV and your MRV. You still want to adjust your program based on how you're responding. Whether you are getting sore, whether you're having overlapping soreness, whether your performance is increasing or decreasing, you still want to adjust on those things. Now, in my experience, it really hasn't been that different. The training volume or the training stress that females respond well to and males. Like for me, it hasn't been that different. I would say for a couple of my females, the volumes are quite a bit higher than what guys can handle, especially like the lower body. But it does seem like it's not terribly different. But I would say if I would have to guess on average, and I would say about 25% of my roster is females, on average, maybe increasing those recommendations by a few sets isn't a bad idea. So maybe guys, 10 to 20 sets, MEV to MRV. Females, maybe it's a little bit more like 13 to 25 or something like that. But my experience, it hasn't been terribly different. All right. But the concept still applies. Still train within your MEV and MRV and adjust based on how you're specifically responding. All right. So I hope that helps you there. And the third question, we are flying through these, is it asked me kind of, could cryolipolysis, which I'll explain what that is, be beneficial for people that were previously overweight? So cryolipolysis is basically freezing fat cells to get rid of fat cells. And the research on this is actually pretty favorable towards this being an effective solution to reducing fat cell volume in a certain area. The catch is that it costs like $1,500 per treatment, and in like less than 1% of the cases, you get this paradoxical fat gain to where instead of decreasing fat volume, you increase it. But super rare. And you could potentially get a liposuction or something like that to cure that. But fat cells, when we are adults, it seems as though our fat cell volume is pretty kind of set, meaning we don't seem to decrease or increase our fat cells much anymore when we are adults. The times when we might is if we have rapid weight gain. So if someone gains weight super fast, they might add some fat cells as adults, and you also might add fat cells in adolescence and when you're younger. So if someone was overweight as a kid, like myself, could doing cryolipolysis and getting rid of some of those extra fat cells make it easier for individuals to potentially maintain leanness as they get more trained and as they go through off seasons and stuff like that? Maybe. I think that potentially that could be the case, but I don't think that like cryolipolysis is a solution for having a conducive lifestyle to having a lean physique and stuff like that. I think that you can do a very good job with that alone, and that should be priority one, because if you get this treatment and then you go back to your previous habits, well, it's not going to do shit for you. But for people that are already like pretty advanced, like someone in my situation, like I do think that it's a little bit more tricky, or I have to mind my P's and Q's a little bit more to maintain a certain level of leanness, potentially because I accumulated more fat cells when I was younger and stuff like that. So, hey, maybe this wouldn't be a terrible solution. Now, am I going to do this? No, I would have to see a little bit more literature, and then hopefully people start inventing more and more stuff regarding cryolipolysis, and as it becomes more and more of a thing, I would assume that the supply would go up of cryolipolysis treatments, making it more something that more people can do and stuff like that, which then I would expect potentially the price would go down a little bit. So maybe in the future, when it gets more research and maybe more affordable, then hey, maybe it's something to consider. But it is interesting and something that, hey, might be beneficial for people in the future. All right. And the final question here, only had 4 this week, so drop your questions below if you want anything answered next week. Ask me about maximum effective dose per workout. And James Krieger wrote a fantastic article called something regarding the definite guide or the evidence-based Bible to single session volume or something like that. It's really good. And one huge takeaway that he mentions is that in a single session, it doesn't seem as though much more than 10 sets per muscle for primary movers. So primary movers would be like on a bench press, your triceps still count. On a barbell row, your biceps still count. Primary movers. So much more than 10 sets in a single session probably isn't doing a whole lot for you. You're probably approaching that limit to what's going to be effective. But it seems as though up to 30 plus sets per week might be effective if you're training a muscle like 3 times per week. So it seems as though you could have weekly volumes of up to 30 sets a week at the most. Maybe you work up to that for specific muscles. But you're probably going to want to spread that out at least over 3 or 4 sessions. So I would say a good rule of thumb is training each muscle with 3 to 8 sets per session and working within your MEV to your MRV. And for muscles that tend to respond better to higher volumes, spread that out over a greater frequency. So like if your delts can respond up to 30 sets, we'll spread that across, I would say at least like 4 sessions is probably what I would like to do there. All right. But a good rule of thumb is sticking to about 3 to 8 sets per session. And then once you're recovering well from that or recovering well from a certain volume each week, and you think that you can handle more volume, and say you're doing 2 sessions of 8 sets, but you're like, hey, I can handle a little bit more here. I'm still recovering well and all that sort of thing. Well, then I would probably add another session rather than adding additional volume on those specific sessions. All right, so I think that there probably is a maximum effective dose per session, and I think it's probably around that 8 to 10 set mark. All right, so that is all the questions I had this week. Drop a comment below if you have any questions for next week, and I'll see you next Sunday.